were you at the Senior Bowl?
I was.
That's great context because I was there too. And one of the first players to stand out to me, I'm a fantasy guy, so I'm not watching the big uglies, you know? Malachi Corley just running through a corner. Like, I mean, look, I know our draft guy, Brett Whitefield, was sitting right next to me, and he's like, yeah, I'd like to see him actually run a route, but that was cool. Malachi Corley, I call him, Connor, lovingly, an asshole.
Yeah.
What did you think of him in your evaluations?
Yeah, so Corley, to me, I had written down in my scattering report, he was really the Rolls Royce of gadget players, right? Just somebody that you can. I had a second round grade on him in this really deep wide receiver class. I had him as wide receiver 14. He was drafted outside the top 10 wide receivers because you look at him and you go, okay, there's a very specific role for him. We're going to like him in the slot. We're going to like him in the quick passing game. We're going to like him on screens, maybe some shallow crossers. Yes, he's somebody that we can use in certain red zone situations, but really plays with the ball in his hands is what we like best. Now, you go to the Jets where that role is wide open for the taking, right? I mean, you have two perimeter wide receivers in Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams where you go, okay, well, we know what they can do. Now we can actually use Corley in that way. And the kind of sicko I am, because this was Rodgers' pick, right? The Jets did what they wanted to at the 11th overall pick. They traded out of 10 to 11, got extra capital. They took Olu Fashanu, a future franchise tackle. They have a starting tackle in Tyron Smith. So this was kind of Joe Douglas saying, I'm going to get my guy for probably some point of the now, but really for the future. And then Rodgers, you kind of throw him a bone with that second pick in this draft, which is Corley when they trade up to 65. You go back to watch, and I know it's hard for people to imagine this because of how he's been the last couple of years, but Randall Cobb in 2014 had almost 1,300 receiving yards. You look at 2015, he had over 800 receiving yards. They'd use him in the run game as well. You watch the usage with Rodgers to Cobb in that Packers offense for a couple of those years, and it's everything that Corley does really, really well in college. It's the same kind of route concepts. It's the same kind of, hey, how do we find rubs to get him open? How do we find quick ways to get the ball in his hands? Can you make the tough plays over the middle of the field? Like you said, you called him an asshole. It's because he can run right through you, and he looks to run right through you. They kind of want a glass chewer in this room on offense. It's not that they have a bunch of nice guys, but they have guys that, they're not built that way. There's not a lot of guys built that way, so they wanted that identity in the room, and that's what Rodgers has now. What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will go wrong. Applied to the New York Jets in 2023. And quite frankly, plenty of times before that. But will it happen again in 2024 to Aaron Rodgers' boys? And if so, it can't be as bad as last year. Can it? I'm Joe Dolan, and I spoke with Connor Rodgers of NBC Sports and SNY to dissect the Jets from a fantasy football perspective. Like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the Fantasy Points channel for 32 breakdowns for all 32 NFL teams. So, Connor, my overarching question here is, if we start on a macro level in discussing the 2024 New York Jets, what could you possibly learn from them last year that we can apply to 2024?
I think the safe answer is that the floor for Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall is something you feel good about because they were able to produce with quarterback play that is just as bad as you can ever imagine. And with Breece, it was at the point with the offensive line injuries that, it was hard to get him back to the line of scrimmage, but the kind of factor he is in the pass game allows him to kind of elevate himself to a different area. And then, of course, with Garrett being the true number one wide receiver on this team, still being the true number one wide receiver on this team, but actually having two guys on the roster that could throw him the football consistently. That's my biggest takeaways because, Joe, we're looking at a team where the offensive line looks a lot different. With Rodgers back, I think the play calling will be a lot different because he has the upper hand over Hackett, for better or for worse on that. And then there's going to be a lot of new pieces in this offense that they're so much harder to project whether they're rookies or whether there's health questions.
Yeah. So let's go to Breece Hall before we get to Aaron Rodgers. As of right now, Underdog Fantasy best ball drafts, RB2, RB3, you'll see in multiple drafts, which I think is fair. I actually personally have him at RB2. But the interesting thing about the Jets is they drafted 2 day 3 running backs this year. So what should we take away from that when it comes to Breece Hall's role as a potential bell cow?
It is really interesting because you have a day 3 guy last year that I think has promise in Izzy Abanikanda. And then now you're seeing the offense identity completely change, where they kind of want to be like the hammer to the nail. They want to be a man scheme. They want to run downhill, and they take two guys that's what they excel in Braylon Allen and of course Isaiah Davis. So when you look at that situation, it makes you wonder a couple of things. You got to talk about it with Breece Hall. Like, how will that affect him? Will that affect him in the red zone? Can that get him some breathers? I think I look at it a little bit more optimistic probably than most in fantasy, because now the Jets, it was mind boggling, but they would so often, it felt like, try to get Dalvin Cook or Michael Carter on the field on third down. And Breece Hall is far and away their best third down
Right.
running back, right? So you look at it, but it felt like they had so much fear of burning Breece out coming off the injury that they kind of had to pick their sweet spots. Maybe they just didn't pick them the right way. With those other guys in the fold on a really deep running back roster, now you have some early down runners to give Breece a breather. But hey, it's 3rd and 6. Breece Hall has to be on the field, right? Like, your best players need to be on the field on those key money downs that keep drives going. So I don't think it's going to really eat into Breece's overall workload that matters from fantasy points perspective, right? I mean, this is a guy that's still going to get a lot of targets in a pass game, that wants to get the ball out, a quarterback that really cannot take a lot of hits. And then I think overall, when it gets into the red area, yeah, could there be opportunities for those other guys? Sure. But Breece Hall is still the most talented offensive player they had, and they are going to use him in that
Yeah.
light.
So Nathaniel Hackett obviously is kind of like the elephant in the room here, with the exception of Aaron Rodgers. And there were some vague reports, I guess, that the Jets were looking to either kind of reduce his impact in the offensive room, or maybe even outright replace him. Was your take on that? Is that an accurate assessment of the situation?
Yeah, I think so. I'd heard some rumblings, and this was way back when it was actually going on, and then of course it trickled out after the draft, that they were at least sniffing around older offensive minds to kind of be another voice in the room. And that's not uncommon across the NFL to have that kind of voice while also having an offensive coordinator. And from what I had heard, it just never really went anywhere, whether there wasn't interest from whoever they had reached out to, because most likely those guys were already retired. It's not like they were trying to poach people from another team, because, mind you, it's a senior offensive assistant. So that's somebody that has to have more experience than Hackett. And say what you want about Hackett, we all know he's on his best day, a below average offensive coordinator. But the bottom line is he has a lot of experience. So if you're bringing somebody in, they really have to have a ton of experience. It didn't go anywhere. I think it shows the concerns when it's life without Rodgers. That's what it is to me. When Rodgers got hurt 4 plays into the year last year, it turned into Zach Wilson's offense and the things Rodgers is comfortable doing and wants to do, which it's Rodgers' choice first, right? And then
Mhm.
Hackett. Once Rodgers was out of the picture, well, then Hackett actually had to be the offensive coordinator in the room for Zach Wilson, where the strengths and the things he's more comfortable with might be different. And it trickled on to Trevor Siemian, Tim Boyle, whoever you want to talk about. So I think the conversation around Hackett is, if Rodgers misses time, Tyrod Taylor's not coming in and being like, okay, it's Tyrod Taylor's offense, right? You need somebody up above that's actually going to be constructing and designing the offense. And when the plays come into the huddle, they're not going to change it as much as Aaron Rodgers will with that, autonomy. So I think that's what the Jets had some concerns with, is that he was really bad in that situation last year when they needed an adult in the room to take over the offense. Now, in my opinion, it feels like the Jets are betting on talent to overcome offensive coaching in that spot. They went out and bought an offensive line. They went out and got Mike Williams. Aaron Rodgers and Tyrod Taylor are in this quarterback room. You have Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, and you drafted Malachi Corley. You moved up to get Malachi Corley. So it's a dangerous predicament when injuries start to come into the picture, but the Jets are hoping that they have a little better luck in that area this year.
Let's get to Rodgers. I'm sure you've watched way more Pat McAfee show than you ever planned to do this past year, but now practices are happening. He's been meeting with the media. You obviously are plugged in. What's the confidence level in Rodgers' ability to, now at close to 40, a year removed from a career-altering injury, what is the confidence level that the Jets are going to get the guy they paid for?
I think because of the offensive line in place, and what they want to do offensively, they feel really good about it. Now, there's just no way around it. You have to have concerns. I mean, the injuries over his last couple of years, the age, obviously, he'd be an outlier if he played a full season and threw for over 4,000 yards and 35 touchdowns on. And I don't think the Jets want him to be that guy. I think everything you're seeing with the construction of this offense is telling you something different. The drafting of Malachi Corley, a quick pass game target. Garrett Wilson is a guy that could work in that part of the field. Mike Williams, when healthy, is a guy that can give you the jump balls down the field, which is going to be a part of this offense. But I think they want to get the ball out quickly. They want to be a running team. They want to have that adult in the room at quarterback that can make the big play when they absolutely need to call upon that. But the way the Jets have built this roster, they don't want to be playing in a lot of those situations. They want their defense to be one of the best in the NFL, which most of the time last year it looked like that. They want their run game to be one of the best in the NFL with Breece Hall, which it has the potential to if the offensive line can stay healthy. And then, hey, it's a big spot. Aaron Rodgers, we need to play from you. Okay, we're going to take our chances here because we know you can do that. So it's volatile. There's no other way to describe this position right now. I mean, do I think Rodgers is going to play every game this year and be healthy and be himself? I think that's a stretch. Do I think Rodgers can also play enough and be close enough of the version of himself where, say, he's a top 13 quarterback and the Jets are really good with a top 13 quarterback? Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. So if you're looking for Aaron Rodgers, the MVP version that's going to carry 3 relevant wide receivers in fantasy, a tight end that you feel like you could play most weeks, and then Breece Hall to be Breece Hall, that's probably stretching the limits. But to actually get the top guys the ball and for the Jets to be a competent offense, that's absolutely in the cards.
So one of the things that really hurt the Jets last year, you mentioned Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall produced despite Zach Wilson. How much more confident can fantasy players who are spending first round picks on Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson be in the event that Aaron Rodgers does miss a game this year? How much a priority was that backup quarterback position, a position where they didn't really invest last year because I guess they still had some lingering belief in Zach Wilson, but Tyrod Taylor coming in, how big a priority was that for the Jets and Joe Douglas?
It was massive. They went out and got Tyrod very early on. They gave him 2 years of money, and I know it's not all guaranteed, but it's still, better end quarterback money for a guy that the room is going to believe in, right? That's what it comes down to is that it's, you have an adult under center. You have somebody that has shown even at his age and with his experience that it felt like the Giants even got a shot in the arm when Tyrod had to play, and it just kind of spin. That offense didn't have a lot around it as well. So I think that's what it comes down to is that the drop off last year with the Jets when Rodgers got hurt was essentially losing what they thought was going to be a top 8 to 10 quarterback. And they went down to arguably and probably pretty easily having the worst quarterback situation in football. And it didn't even feel like the Jets were in a tier where it was a fringe worst quarterback situation in football. A lot of times it felt like they were in their own unique category. This year, if you can have a top 23-ish, 24-ish quarterback, if you have to move to Tyrod, that's a massive difference from the worst in football by a wide margin, because that means you're getting competent play. You're being able to support a number 1 wide receiver, and the defense isn't selling out against a hero running back play after play after play. So I think that's why the Jets looked at Tyrod and said, okay, it gives us a little mobility in this offense. And it's no shock they drafted Jordan Travis, who has a lot of similarities to Tyrod Taylor when he's healthy enough to play, because they like that element to their offense. But guys that can play point guard and distribute the ball to the excellent playmakers they have at such a young age.
Beyond Garrett Wilson, they obviously signed Mike Williams, who has had his injury problems in the past, and brought in Malachi Corley. Do you anticipate if there's no health issues with these guys, will they play ahead of Rodgers' henchman, Allen Lazard?
Yeah, they will. I think when it comes down to it, Lazard was just completely ineffective last year. He's not a guy that separates very well. I think that, when it comes down to it as well, it's just that now you have a guy in Mike Williams that's better in the red zone than Allen Lazard. One of the reasons they brought him in was to bring some size to the wide receiver room before Corey Davis abruptly retired. And then it's pretty easy to kind of just figure out the personnel groupings of this offense, right? Garrett Wilson's going to be on the field. Mike Williams is going to be on the field. Tyler Conklin's going to be on the field. Okay, well, Malachi Corley is going to play a lot of the slot, but what purpose does Lazard serve? I think is what it comes down to. And I just don't see much of a role for him in this offense unless Rodgers can get him fully bought back in. I just don't think he's more talented than any of those guys. To be quite honest with you, Joe, I see a scenario this summer where Jason Brownlee outperforms Allen Lazard and is the number 5 wide receiver on this team. Xavier Gipson is a guy that probably makes the team because he's their returner, and they like him as a developmental backup slot. So if Brownlee and Gipson are in that 4, 5, 6-ish kind of mold, and you need a special teamer, which Lazard does not play in the 6th spot, which they like in Irvin Charles. Is Lazard even on this team? cut your losses, eat the money, and just deal with a player that was completely ineffective.
Were you at the Senior Bowl?
I was.
Yeah, so that's great context because I was there too. And one of the first players to stand out to me, I'm a fantasy guy, so I'm not watching the big uglies, you know.
Yeah.
I
Well,
know
you
the
get to
Jets
watch the
drafted.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, Malachi Corley just outright
Oh
right
yeah.
running through a corner. Like, I mean, look, I know I was our draft guy Brett Whitefield was sitting right next to me, and he's like, "Yeah, I'd like to see him actually run a route, but that was cool." Malachi Corley, I call him Connor lovingly an asshole. Um,
Yeah.
what did you think of him in your evaluations? Separate from the team fit with the Jets.
Yeah, so Corley to me, I'd written down in my scattering report, he was really the Rolls Royce of gadget players, right? Just somebody that you can. I had a second round grade on him in this really deep wide receiver class. I had him as wide receiver 14. He was drafted outside the top 10 wide receivers because you look at him and you go, okay, there's a very specific role for him. We're going to like him in the slot. We're going to like him in the quick passing game. We're going to like him on screens, maybe some shallow crossers. Yes, he's somebody that we can use in certain red zone situations, but really plays with the ball in his hands is what we like best. Now, you go to the Jets where that role is wide open for the taking, right? I mean, you have two perimeter wide receivers in Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams where you go, okay, well, we know what they can do. Now we can actually use Corley in that way. And the kind of sicko I am, because this was Rodgers' pick, right? The Jets did what they wanted to at the 11th overall pick. They traded out of 10 to 11, got extra capital. They took Olu Fashanu, a future franchise tackle. They have a starting tackle in Tyron Smith. So this was kind of Joe Douglas saying, I'm going to get my guy for probably some point of the now, but really for the future. And then Rodgers, you kind of throw him a bone with that second pick in this draft, which is Corley when they trade up to 65. You go back to watch, and I know it's hard for people to imagine this because of how he's been the last couple of years, but Randall Cobb in 2014 had almost 1,300 receiving yards. You look at 2015, he had over 800 receiving yards. They'd use him in the run game as well. You watch the usage with Rodgers to Cobb in that Packers offense for a couple of those years, and it's everything that Corley does really, really well in college. It's the same kind of route concepts. It's the same kind of, hey, how do we find rubs to get him open? How do we find quick ways to get the ball in his hands? Can you make the tough plays over the middle of the field? Like you said, you called him an asshole. It's because he can run right through you and he looks to run right through you. They kind of want a glass chewer in this room on offense. It's not that they have a bunch of nice guys, but they have guys that, they're not built that way. There's not a lot of guys built that way. So they wanted that identity in the room. And that's what Rodgers has now.
So you mentioned it's probably a stretch to get 3 receivers or an elite running back and a tight end, but I do have to ask about the tight end position because, as you well know, it is so thin for fantasy football. So we're looking for some of these guys down the board who might be able to produce for us, give us some weekly, maybe not a weekly starting tight end, but give us somebody we can stream on a week-to-week basis. Do you think Tyler Conklin fits that mold?
I do because listen, is he coming off a career year? Yes, it's 621 yards. But he is now 3 years in a row. When you factor in the last year at Minnesota and the 2 years with the Jets, he's hovered right below or right over 600 yards in those 3 years. It's not like it was a flash in the pan or total product of bad quarterback play and just need to dump it down to the tight end. What I'll say for Conklin is this: he didn't have any touchdowns last year, right? But I think the yardage and the targets might go a hair down. Can I see him having 570 yards this year and maybe the targets go down to 75 to 80? Okay, so those numbers take a dip, but he could easily catch 5 touchdowns, or 6 or 7, because the reality is outside of Garrett Wilson, Mike Williams is coming off significant injury. Who's the red zone presence in this offense? It's Tyler Conklin is probably out of the gate the number 2 red zone presence, and then maybe the number 3 when Williams is healthier. So I think that if you're looking for streamer format, Conklin will fit that. Maybe not a guy that you set and forget in your lineup every week. And a lot of those guys don't exist in the tight end world, like you said. I mean, Laporta, Kelsey, Andrews. I mean, we love to have those guys if you have them, but the reality is often than not, especially during the bye weeks, you're looking for some kind of streaming option. And I think Conklin will fit that mold against inferior defenses.
So we mentioned the worst case scenario at the quarterback position for the Jets is likely, almost certainly better than the worst case scenario that actually unfolded last year. Do you feel the same way about this, what you termed a bought offensive line? Do you feel like the worst case scenario for this offensive line, which brings in a guy in Tyron Smith who certainly is on his last legs, quite literally and metaphorically, do you think that's still the case here because of all the talent they added up front?
Well, the fashion new pick is what makes the answer they're protected now. If you asked me this before the draft, it was nail biting, right? There's no way around it. Tyron Smith hasn't played a full season since 2015. Then you have John Simpson at left guard. I'd call him the weaker link on the offensive line, which if he's your weakest link, okay, you're fine. Then you have Joe Tippmann at center coming off a strong rookie season, Elijah Vera Tucker at right guard, and then Morgan Moses, another 33-year-old tackle on the right side. So now you're looking at it and going, okay, well, if one of our tackles gets hurt, then the 11th overall pick in the draft is playing. That's a good place to be in. If one of our guards or centers get hurt, Wes Schweitzer is in. He's a very capable backup, like first man up, backup interior offensive lineman. And then if you had two tackles hurt, Max Mitchell, Carter Warren, they like those guys. They are fourth string ish tackles for a reason. But I think when you look at this group, it just feels like they're much further away from the bottom completely falling out than last year, where I didn't think their line was really that good coming into the year. Honestly, when they went into camp and they were giving Max Mitchell first team reps, and then Becton kind of by default played his way into first team reps. It wasn't that Becton was spectacular. It's just the other guys were so bad. And then Becton had a really, really bad season. That group on paper wasn't really that impressive. And then they lost their best guy in Elijah Vera Tucker. With the Jets this year, at least the front line looks good. And then the second line of defense is capable. Last year, I don't think you could have said that.
One more before we let you go, and I just want to kind of take a pulse of the Jet fan base. Last year, Jets fans in my life, this was the most excited I've seen them since the Rex and Sanchez days, like when
Yeah.
they were winning games magically. Is that level of optimism still existing this year, or has it become much more guarded, kind of I've been tortured too many times kind of feeling for Jets fans?
It's the latter. It's, walking on eggshells, cautious. I remember because 2009, they had that run with Rex where everybody's jaw kind of hit the floor. Like, how did this team with a rookie quarterback that was completely ineffective make the AFC championship game? So then they went into 2010, and the expectations were we're going to run through everybody because we made the roster better. Sanchez is going into year two. We still have the best run game and defense in football. And they went to the AFC title game again. I don't see the expectations and excitement on that level this year because of the potential of the shoe being kind of the rug being kind of pulled out from under you. With if Rodgers gets hurt, everybody looks around and goes, "Oh, here we go again." Now, I think that's going the pendulum going too far the other way because I think Tyrod Taylor is capable and this is a good roster on paper in an AFC that has a lot of questions. Right, the Bills are still the favorite for this division, but they got worse. There's no way around it. The Dolphins and the Jets, okay, toss it up either way you want it. And New England has taken a complete rebuild over. Then you look at the rest of the conference, it's all dependent on health. And the same could be said for the Jets. Is Joe Burrow going to stay healthy for the Bengals? I think the Chargers are coming. I don't know if it's this year, but I think that team has the right identity and direction with the guys they have at the top now. And then you look at Mahomes is Mahomes and Lamar is Lamar. But at the end of the day, it just feels like for the Jets, there is something there for the taking, even if that's making the playoffs and winning a game, something the Jets have not done since 2010, by the way. But I think everybody is just very nervous knowing that, they're a Murphy's Law team. Like, you could expect the worst to happen because of the way you've built key positions on the team with age. And that was the thought process of drafting Fashanu. But you can't just go draft a quarterback that can come in and replace Rodgers if he gets hurt, which makes the entire thing really interesting.
His name is Connor Rodgers. You can catch his work at NBC Sports as an NFL draft analyst and, of course, the Fantasy Football Happy Hour. He is the Jets pre- and post-game host for SNY TV. Connor, newlywed, by the way, just got back from sunning himself, and he is right back to the grind. Follow him on Twitter at Connor with two N's, J. Rodgers. Connor, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thanks so much for joining me on Franchise Focus.
Thanks, Joe. It was a blast, man. I really appreciate it.